There were so many players who were actually involved in trying to manipulate information around the election that it was just sort of a tsunami of false information. So you weren't able to look at one specific entity or actor and say that, oh, it was the Chinese or the Iranians, and they ran this disinformation campaign trying to boost this candidate over another candidate. There was so much crap that was out there, some foreign, but most of it domestic, that I think it just became this sort of cesspool of false information.
So, welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, we're talking to Bret Schafer, the Media and Digital Disinformation Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He's also appeared in the New York Times, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, been interviewed by NPR, PBS, and the BBC. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Yeah. Thanks for talking to me again. It's been a few years. Before we get started, I have to plug two things. First of all, my book, which I was writing at the time we spoke last, is now out. Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. If you want to learn more about what we're going to discuss today, about how social media and technology is disrupting democracy, please go and buy it. And also our sponsor, ExpressVPN. You can get 12 months with 35% off and a 30-day money-back guarantee. So, Bret, how much worse have things got for the state of democracy since we last spoke? It's been about 3 years.
Well, things weren't great when we spoke 3 years ago either. We were coming right out of Brexit, the election of Donald Trump. We weren't exactly in a great place then. Clearly, I don't think things have improved, and COVID has just thrown a little accelerant on the fire as well. So from the U.S. perspective, I guess if you're being an optimist, you could look at this last election and say there's been a bit of a course correction of sorts. However, I think if you look at how that election went down and the aftermath of the election, it's not really a source of optimism for the future. There's roughly a quarter of Americans who just do not believe that the election was legitimate and believe it was stolen. And that's obviously a much bigger problem than saying, hey, my preferred candidate didn't get elected, or there was some mis or disinformation that led to people voting for one candidate over another based on false promises. People do not fundamentally trust that elections, that their vote in an election will be counted and that elections are legitimate. Like, that's the bedrock of democracy, and it all starts to crumble from there. So I think, just looking from the U.S. perspective, we're not in great shape, and there's a lot of work to be done.
One of the things that I keep discussing with friends of mine is that, like, we can't believe that given how much problems we know there are with just any form of technology, in that it's almost always hackable, or can go wrong, or there's always something you can question about it. We honestly can't believe that you use the voting machines that you do, like either electronic machines to count the votes or tally them. Because we have everything done by hand in the UK. We count all our ballots are counted by hand. Even in Northern Ireland, where we have a super complicated proportional representation system, where we have to number our preferred candidates we're meant to number it 1 through however many people there are there. So we count the first preference votes, and then we split them all up and we count the second preference votes. And honestly, it shocks me that you still have electronic voting machines, given the amount of problems and questions that could be raised over it. Is there anyone discussing that you've seen?
Yeah, no, there have been a ton of discussions, and there were a ton of improvements actually made from 2016 to 2020. So a lot of states, and in particular, most of the swing states, which, if you follow US elections, it's really about 10 states. I think all of those states actually implemented paper ballot backups. So there at least were some protections put in place. So when they do the post-election audits, you can go back and actually find a paper record trail, so that it's not all just electronic. The other benefit is actually this sort of American dysfunction or fragmentation of our voting process. we don't have one election system. We essentially have 10,000. I mean, every local county administers their own election. Like, yes, there's some standards set at the federal level, and then the states kind of conduct them. But they were so different from state to state, and again, even county to county, that there's not like one voting machine being used. There are many. So the theory is, yes, they're all a bit vulnerable, but it's harder to hack an entire election because you're having to get into so many different systems that, like, you certainly can get into one, you can cause problems at a local level. And clearly, if you're talking about the optics of the election, that would be enough to get people to really contest the results. But there actually have been some improvements made over the last 4 years to try to shore up our election system. That doesn't mean they're still not vulnerable, and there's a lot more work to be done, but it has gotten a little bit better.
Like the two different, like, okay, so in 2016, there was once Trump had won, there was the narrative that the election had been stolen or hacked by the Russians, and then in this case, we've had the narrative that it was hacked or stolen by some combination of the Democrats and the Chinese Communist Party and maybe the Venezuelans. I'm just telling you what the story is. But essentially, like, we're talking about two different types of hacking or disruption here. So we're talking about like the physical, like, idea that people had changed votes in certain machines, or like brought in fraudulent ballots or used fake addresses. And then there's the idea is that that Russia had hacked the election through disinformation, propaganda. They used like bots and trolls online to kind of stir up and sort of pour fire onto hot button issues. Why do you think that we haven't really concerned ourselves with that side of things in the 2020 election, given that we know that sort of thing is still possible, still going on, and is potentially even more pervasive? Like, why do you think that was essentially ignored, or has been?
Well, the perception hacking side of things, which is, of course, what the issue was with Russia in 2016, there was actually a lot of coverage of that in the lead up to the election. And there was a lot more focus on that, both within the government and outside the government. I mean, my organization looks at that. Many others were stood up in the 4 years between the 2016-2020 election. And you had at the Department of Homeland Security, you had CISA, which was set up specifically to look at that. So you had a lot more people paying attention to that issue. So it got a ton of coverage in the lead up. But you're right, it obviously did not get the kind of coverage afterward that, like, the actual sort of hacking narrative got. Or hacking isn't even the right term. This is the sort of stolen election narrative. I think part of the problem, or part of the reason that there was this sort of shift in narrative, is that there were so many players who were actually involved in trying to manipulate information around the election that it was just sort of a tsunami of false information. So you weren't able to look at one specific entity or actor and say that, oh, it was the Chinese or the Iranians, and they ran this disinformation campaign trying to boost this candidate over another candidate. There was so much crap that was out there, some foreign, but most of it domestic, that I think it just became this sort of cesspool of false information where people were unable to disentangle where the false information was coming from. So it's not as if the information space was better this time around. It certainly was not. It was much, much, much worse. It was just, you were able to kind of isolate what Russia did to a degree in 2016, where now that felt like a drop in the ocean of false information. And so I think that's why that narrative hasn't gotten as much coverage. And then, of course, it's part of it is signaling from the top. So when President Trump, in the lead up to the election, and certainly after the election, was saying that, the election was stolen, that machines were manipulated, there were some of these crazy conspiracies, as you mentioned, that it was the ghost of Hugo Chavez who somehow was pulling the strings. That just kind of took over. So it was a little bit less about the sort of the narratives and the perception hacking, a little bit more about actual manipulation of vote tallies, especially around mail-in voting, which of course became a much more prominent thing because of the coronavirus.
I mean, do you think that's the way that we're just our world is going to exist now? Is like you described it as that like cesspool of false information. Like, is that just what we're going to have to wade through on like a day-to-day basis?
I think so, or at least in the near term. I mean, obviously, I want to be optimistic and hope solution down the road because it's not a very pleasant world to live in, honestly, where the information online is just untrustworthy. Everyone feels like it's being manipulated. Our sense of an objective truth starts to erode. But this is one of the things that we talked about after 2016 is like, yes, we knew what the Russians did. Whether or not it was effective is, I think, still open to debate. But one of the things we highlighted is like, it was kind of sophisticated, but it kind of wasn't. I mean, the troll operation out of St. Petersburg, the stuff they were putting out was not some sort of psyops. It was not a sort of psyops level where you then looked at, okay, though, they definitely had some impact. So you're having anyone now who has any sort of political motivation, who has economic motivation, any sort of cause they care about, looks at the sort of Russian roadmap from 2016 and says, like, I can do that for for cheap. I can probably do it better. If they're domestic within the U.S., they're unlikely to be, if you have any level of sophistication, they're unlikely to be caught by the social media companies because they're looking at domestic actors. So what we were concerned about, what we saw was this sort of proliferation of bad actors who would see how cheap, how easy, how effective this is, and would launch their own sort of disinformation operations. So I think what we're going to see is this sort of democratization of influence campaigns, info ops, but also what we have seen is the commercialization of it. So now you do not have to be technically sophisticated to run essentially your own sort of troll farm or your own kind of bot spamming campaign. There are plenty of companies that you just need to Google to find who will run these campaigns for you. Is that going to swing a national election? No. But if you're talking down at the like local level, if you've got some mayoral race, if you have a ballot measure, that people don't go into it with any sort of preconceived notions of what they believe in. It's very different from a national election where people are kind of Republicans, they're Democrats, very hard to change their opinions. You're talking about an issue that people don't know much about. California, for example, every year has like 20, 30 different ballot measures. Nobody knows what they're about. They're very complicated. They're written by special interests. Nobody knows what they're voting on. So it's all about the information out there. I think what we're going to see in the future is just these massive professional disinfo campaigns targeted at these smaller elections, again, these ballot measures, and those can have a huge impact. So that's my concern now going forward is like everyone has learned over the past 4 years that if you want to manipulate the truth, if you want to manipulate voters, it's really not that difficult.
Yeah, I mean, like, do you really think that so you mentioned that you don't think this like sort of targeted trolling campaign could swing a national election. Are you familiar with the idea of Trevor's axiom?
I'm not, no.
Okay, so I actually wrote about this in my book. This is an excellent opportunity to plug it. And I honestly haven't been able to find an earlier source of this term or an earlier explanation of this term than South Park. They did an absolutely stunning explanation of how it works. It's like a 30-second video. I'll put it in the link below. But essentially, they say that like all that it requires to like blow up certain hot button issues and turn them into national conversations is like the right trolling. So like all you have to do is like abuse one person, and it doesn't even have to be like someone like specifically bad, but all you're trying to do is like get someone to respond to that in such a self-righteous way that other people who may not agree with the original troll jump on the other person, and it just like explodes out with people just being hypocritical or self-righteous or stupid or provocative for the fun of it, or all just like misconstrued in the 140 280 character replies that we get. And essentially we're the thesis is basically that I think we might be like missing how much blowing something up with just like a tiny amount of influence can actually affect a national like conversation. One of the examples I use in my book is there was a couple of like terror attacks during the 2017 or in the run up to the UK 2017 election. And one guy had tweeted, this troll, I think it's Lone Star something. He had tweeted a picture of this like this woman in a burqa or in a headdress, like walking past like a victim or someone who had been like almost hurt by in the attack. And it would like the caption was like, oh, here, look, this person's just walking by, ignoring, you know, good British citizens who have been hurt by the victims of terrorism. And it turns out she was on her phone, like calling an ambulance.
Yeah, no, I know that image. Yeah.
Yeah, and it blew up, and the next day it was on the front page of the Daily Mail. So like, are you that confident that these things can like blow up to affect?
No, not at all. No, to be clear, I sort of meant these kind of for-profit, you know, spend $1,000, get a company in Belarus or the Philippines to run this sort of low-grade troll operation for you. Right, okay. But no, what you pointed out, I agree with entirely, and it's one of the issues that we have struggled, I think, to get across to people, because everybody is looking for the sort of cause and effect of a disinformation campaign and saying, often looking at metrics that I think are completely flawed, and particularly on social media, saying, well, like, you know, this account had 250 followers and was only retweeted 20 times. You know, looking at engagement metrics as our measure of effect, of the influence of the campaign, I think it is so deeply, deeply flawed, because, you know, what we talk about is often the sort of term information laundering, and the ability to put a piece of information out there, and the original piece of information doesn't need to get a ton of traction on its own. It just, as you pointed out, it needs to find the right person or group who take it and run with it. And then it kind of gains momentum on its own. It becomes this sort of organic movement. I mean, astroturfed, but like, it takes a life of its own. And that's why it's so difficult to get to the impact question. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times over the last 4 years we've been asked by journalists, like, does this matter? Did this have any impact? And often it's, I don't know, because it's impossible to judge. I mean, you could look at the end results of saying, like, this campaign looked to get this person elected, that person got elected. There's a causation correlation issue there. But then there's often the efforts to kind of minimize a campaign by saying, like, well, you know, this is an obscure website, it doesn't get a lot of traffic. Very hard to track, though. You know, one person sees it, that plants a sort of seed in their mind. They do a bit of their own research. They put their own spin on it. And then it's the second article that causes the real accelerant and causes a movement to take hold. So no, to be clear, I do think trolling campaigns, even kind of low-level trolling campaigns, can be effective enough to at least impact national elections or national campaigns. But you know, what I was saying is more that a lot of this stuff is not really intended to do that, and most of it is run by people who are not particularly sophisticated. But it's always tough to measure the impact of a campaign.
I mean, Tim Pool talks a lot about the idea of fifth generational warfare. That like the idea that nations will engage in like physical war in the fashion that we've seen in history, like even up to like the Vietnam War or Iraq or even like anything like that, where physical troops are on the ground. And he basically thinks that those days are gone, essentially, and that we're engaged in this like this type of like information war with we have no idea who. Like in that kind of context, like where concerns you more? Is it like Russia, or is it China, or is it, say, like our own citizens or governments? Like where is the biggest threat, do you think, right now?
I'll give a cop-out answer and say all of the above, but if I'm weighing them, I would say it is our own governments, but more our own citizens, our fellow citizens. So you know, it's kind of a cliche, but I think it's true. When people live in a society that they feel is equitable and just, and they trust their government and they feel like they're being represented, these external threats become less of a threat, right? I mean, particularly if you're looking at more of the sort of Russian style campaign, which is to amplify divisions and that kind of thing, like that is just not going to be effective if you don't have individuals on the ground in a targeted country who have these real or perceived grievances that they're able to exploit. So like, I look at the domestic issue as being the far bigger issue. And, everyone always says when we have these conversations, like, we need to improve trust in government and, solve some of these cohesion issues. Obviously, that's way easier said than done. But of course, that is the underlying issue that allows foreign actors to, exploit those things. Of the two, if you're looking at Russia and China, I mean, Russia's way better at information warfare right now than China, at least globally. I mean, China is, I think, effective in its own sort of backyard to a degree. But if you look at sort of Russian versus Chinese trolling efforts that have targeted the US, I mean, they're not even close in terms of sophistication. So in the near term, again, this is sort of it was an original term or sort of concept 3 or 4 years ago now, but it'd be cliche. But looking at Russia as this sort of category 3 hurricane that can cause a lot of damage in the near term, but doesn't kind of fundamentally alter, the sort of global interest in the way that China is more like climate change. They have the ability to really kind of rewrite the rules. And they have levers that Russia just does not have in terms of their economic levers. So I look at China as the bigger long-term threat in general. Russia is the bigger threat in the near term, just because I think they're much, much better at information warfare than the Chinese right now. But, the Chinese certainly have the capacity. They have the AI capabilities to radically improve, for lack of a better term, over the next several years. But to go back to your original question, like, my concern is always domestic more than anything. And when we were looking at the 2020 election, this is the thing we were kind of trying to stress over and over is, yeah, you got to be concerned about the Russians, the Chinese, I mean, to some degree, the Venezuelans, the Iranians, but like the real threats are going to come within. And that's obviously what happened.
I mean, it like becomes this there's this weird line that we're going to have to try and walk if we attempt to do it, between like allowing things like say like where people allowing people to like spread and post information about like the secret internal war within the government, between the breakaway government and the intelligence agencies, and some guy called Q telling everyone what's going on, and like the ability for like, or people just to lie generally, and sort of claim it is totally true. And on the other end of it, like say there's like the whole like flip side of it is where people who are promoting like genuine truth seem in some cases to be getting banned, like Project Veritas, who I know have made some mistakes, but they're just posting like whistleblowers things from inside social media firms. Like they're gone from Twitter. Like Bret Weinstein's Articles of Unity account that was promoting like rejecting the two-party system, banned from Twitter. Like there's this weird thing where people trying to there's like attacks coming from both sides, where we're trying to figure out like how to deal with like the mass amount of like the cesspool of disinformation as we described it, and still like retain some sort of like freedom of speech rights online. Like where do you guys kind of propose that we start with trying to even just like begin to regulate these companies that are now more powerful than most nations?
Yeah, I mean, the regulation of social media question, I think, is going to be the big thing to watch over the next 2 to 3 years in the Biden administration, and where they take the sort of conversation from where it's been. And I don't think the US is going to be the leader on this, and clearly they have not been to date. I mean, the European Union, the UK have been way more forward-leaning, for better or worse, in trying to regulate social media. And the conversation in the US is so dysfunctional, frankly. I don't see huge room for improvement there, because as you pointed out, the two sides, really it's almost 3 sides, but they're coming from like polar opposite places here, where the Republican position on this is more or less social media companies are not the arbiters of truth. They shouldn't be kicking people off Twitter. Who's Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg to say, who has a microphone in public debate? Where on the left, they're more concerned, obviously, about getting rid of all the bad stuff. And oftentimes, I think looking past some of the negative externalities that you pointed out, that also include of like a lot of these bans, I think sometimes are actually justifiable, but they create this narrative of big tech overreach that gets a lot of people who are more in the center drifting to the right. And, we saw this after the election with the migration of a bunch of conservatives to Parler, to these sort of alt platforms. So you're going to have this balkanization, I think, of internet platforms, all of which purporting to support different sort of interpretations of what free speech is. And so the like filter bubbles we talked about are going to get much, much worse. But when you go back to the regulation question, so in the US context, as I said, there's sort of 3 points of view here. There's actually the libertarian point of view, which says, hey, these are private companies. They can do whatever they want to do. And if you don't like it, go join a different platform. You have no right to be on Facebook. Nobody gave you the right to have a Twitter account. And let the market sort of determine which platforms are more viable. And then, as we discussed, you have this sort of left-right position that are oftentimes a little bit dysfunctional. On the right, honestly, their position makes a little bit less sense when you kind of drill into it. I mean, I think it's a very popular position to say, like, look, who are these unelected guys in Silicon Valley to take down the president's account? I mean, that is a radical, radical step. But they've been opposed to any sort of antitrust regulation that would reduce the power of these companies. And they've also been in favor of getting rid of Section 230, which we can talk forever about that. And of course, if you remove Section 230, the platforms are probably going to double down on their content moderation, because then they're going to be liable for things that are posted that are potentially libelous. So I don't have a huge amount of optimism that we're going to see a government solution, at least in the US, over the next couple of years. And part of the problem, again, is that, like, the baseline of the conversation is really screwed up here. Very rarely at the government level are you having like actual substantive debates about, like, look, content moderation has to exist at some level. Like, we have seen what's happened on platforms where that doesn't exist. And on the other hand, like, yeah, it should be, I think, looked at as a problem that you have companies who can decide not only who you vote for or the causes you support, but what you buy, basically everything, that are just not regulated at all. So I think the solution is to get away from this ad hoc content by content, account by account debate over whether a takedown was legitimate or not, and start looking at the architecture issues. So the ad ecosystem, algorithms, and data. Data probably being the most important, but I'd put ads up there as well, where you then get to the structural issues that exist with these companies, where that's more of like how you regulate the banking system. Like, are their algorithms fair, kind of thing? Which I know that's simplifying things, because often people are like, well, how do we know what Google's algorithm is promoting? Like, I don't think Google knows what their algorithm is promoting, because there's hundreds of algorithms that go into what we see in our news feeds when we query a subject. But I do think there has to be some government regulation there, especially around data. I mean, data is such a valuable currency. It can be manipulated in so many ways. If we're talking about AI improvements for nation states, I mean, the fact that you have these sort of biometric companies, so companies that do these kind of DNA analysis that have no sort of oversight whatsoever. There's fundamental issues there that I think are where regulation should be going. But unfortunately, the conversation tends to be stuck in, well, this tweet was taken down and this tweet wasn't. And there's hypocrisy there because this appears to be supporting a right-leaning cause or a left-leaning cause. Like, I don't think we're ever going to get to a very productive place if that continues to be the sort of baseline of our conversation. Because, like, you're talking about millions of posts a day. There's always going to be, some bias there, individual cases that are not going to be right. And right now, we're just not focusing on the bigger picture issues. Like, we're spending all of our time on these kind of one-off things that I just don't think is very productive.
I mean, like I am sympathetic to the argument that like people that there shouldn't be like a handful of billionaires deciding what people can and can't see. But one of the things that I spoke to Kyle Taylor about, who is the founder of Fair Vote UK, and they're talking about they're trying to campaign to get the government to legislate on these kind of issues. And he said, look, we already have like speech laws set down in law, and in America you've got the First Amendment, and you've got a whole bunch of case law associated with that, and that we don't need to have this debate really, because we've mostly already had it about what's okay to say and what's not. We just need to decide how transparent we want these companies to be about their like ban and review processes, and give people like the right to an appeal, and make them essentially apply their own rules fairly. But I really wanted to go to something you mentioned there about the ad model, because this is something, like, again, I mentioned in my book, where I talked about like at the start of the internet, we basically made this decision that like subscription models weren't where we wanted to go, and that we decided that like our data and like based on an advertising model based on our data was the way forwards, because it was free. And like, like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think you were essentially making the argument that if we were to review the way in which like Facebook or Twitter or Google make their money based on advertising and based on like harvesting as much of our data as possible and wanting to keep us on their platform as long as possible, that perhaps that would solve some of the problems of the way in which they moderate content. Because right now it's aimed at keeping as many people on the platform as possible, and by removing a few people who draw a lot of controversy, you can, you know, make it a safer space for some people, therefore keeping them on longer and making more money. Whereas if we move to a subscription based model, we would be removing that need for Facebook to keep us, or Twitter or whatever, on as long as possible, and therefore would actually help solve that issue. Is that what you were saying?
Well, I think the problem with the subscription-based model is we've now become accustomed to the free model. And it's just going to be really, really hard to convince people like, hey, you now have to pay $5 a month for your Facebook account. Even if that improves your experience dramatically. Like, people don't like going from free to paying for something, even if it improves the service. So what I was talking about, I mean, I think it's a debate we can certainly have. And I mean, there have been plenty of people, including some early Facebook investors, who've said that's the model they should be going towards. What I was looking at more is the issue of like third-party ad tech, and the fact that so many of these sort of for-profit disinfo operations, networks of websites, and just sort of junk news sites. I mean, sites that don't have any kind of political agenda behind them. They're just trying to make money. Those are just being financed by companies who have no idea that they're financing those operations, because of course, the sort of ad placements are just determined by algorithms. Yes, there are a few sort of opt-out. There's an opt-out ability at some level. But what we're looking for is more of a transparent model around third-party ad tech, but also the walled garden advertising on Facebook and Twitter and others, that would allow advertisers to make more responsible, or at least informed, decisions about where their ad money is going, but also allow public interest groups to have a better idea about who's actually funding what, so they can kind of these public pressure campaigns, things like that. Like, right now it's a black box, and there's just no real ability for advertisers or consumers to understand who is being supported by whom, because nobody knows, because there's about 15 different steps in this process and a bunch of different companies, and everybody, there's a huge amount of ad fraud, but everyone's kind of got their hand in another person's pocket, so nobody is dealing with that issue. But if you got to the sort of core issue of advertisers going back to actually sponsoring credible journalism, legitimate journalism, I think you start at least peeling off some of the edges of the problem. But also, as you mentioned, if Facebook and Google were forced to be a little bit more transparent about how things are monetized on their platform, again, I think that starts working towards an internet which may not be less toxic, but at least people have a little bit more control and understanding about how things are being funded and can make more informed choices.
Do you see the like the future of like social media, internet, like news dissemination and whatnot? Like there's kind of two obvious paths we can go down at this point. Like things can become more centralized, and like more of our information can come from like a handful of outlets, say Google, Twitter, Facebook, and they'll kind of continue to expand until one of them becomes Skynet, and then we all are enslaved. Or there's quite a few people pushing like a more decentralized idea. Like there's people starting to move towards things like locals, or there is a site that for the life of me is escaping me the name, that I listened to Tim Pool talking about it. It's essentially like an RSS feed that compiles stuff you post online, but it's linked to the blockchain, so therefore it never goes away. And it's like everyone has their own like little version of it, and essentially they're talking about creating more like almost like a MySpace sort of style like way of having social media, where everyone would have their own little individual page that would never be deleted, that no one was responsible for except you. And like for me, it seems to be like that those are the two sort of potential avenues in which we can go down. Like, which one do you think is more likely?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, going back, the MySpace model is like, that was the first social media site I was on as well. And I've never been personally a huge social media user, but in the early days of social media, that like it was appealing to me. I mean, I sort of got it. It was a way. It was, I think, what it was intended to be, of individuals able to connect with friends and see what they're doing. And like, yes, there's social problems there, but you had less of this issue that we're seeing now, of it just being a place where we're bombarded with everything from disinformation to just like very toxic points of view that are tailored specifically for you. And I don't find my social media experience generally to be enjoyable at this point. So it's like, do we want to revert back to what it was and what it was meant to be? But I think the question that you raised, initially, of like, this is also, this does go to kind of the ad problem that we were discussing, but a bigger issue of where I think Facebook and Google are moving towards, that I understand as being concerning when you talk about, okay, we're going to prioritize authoritative pieces of information or outlets. So, when people run searches, they're going to get the BBC and New York Times and other sort of credible journalism outlets. Like, that makes sense. But what you don't want to see happen is the sort of destruction of some really great citizen journalists in independent alt media outlets. And so there's this real tension there of like wanting to finance a more diverse, credible pot of information or journalists, while at the same time not wanting to create a financing model where it's almost impossible for some of these startups to compete. And I think so that's a real concern in general as we move forward as well. And I honestly, I don't know the answer there. It's just a clear tension that you don't want to just say like, look, you have all of these, weird blogs that are presenting themselves as being in Tennessee, but they're actually run by like political operatives, and they're pushing out these sort of partisan, half truths all the time. Like, yeah, we want to get rid of those, or at least minimize like those being the things that are showing up in our feeds. But we don't want to create the system like the only thing you're going to be able to see is, BBC, Washington Post, CNN, because I think that destroys, again, the good parts of the early 2000s internet, where you did see this explosion of citizen journalism. So I don't know the answer there, but I think that is the great tension of like, we want to get to a place where you look at the top 10 most shared URLs on Facebook, and 8 of them aren't these just sort of junk news sites, and you're not having your aunt sort of bombard you with these just like absolutely insane stories that come out of these outlets. You're like, I mean, do you know what this site is, kind of thing? Well, at the same time, we don't want to get to a thing where it's like, we only are going to have 10 sources of information that somebody has determined to be credible, and that's it on these platforms. Because one, I just don't think that's a good thing in general. Two, I think you're going to see mass migration to alt platform sites where there's going to be more radical viewpoints. I mean, when you cut off sources of information that people trust, whether they should trust them or not, they're going to go searching for them, and they often go searching for them in darker and darker places. So I don't think that that is a good model to adopt either.
It definitely kind of ruins the, like, if there's say like 5 news outlets or 10 news outlets that are the authority, then like anything that's not them just dies, and therefore it's like it's the same sort of like argument that people make for like free markets in almost everything,
right?
That like you need, if you get bad at your job, say you're the BBC or say you're CNN, and you know, like half the country thinks that you're just fake news, that you should start to probably suffer if your coverage is that bad, or if you're not actually providing journalism anymore, you're just providing like outrage, clickbait, political theater,
right?
Which arguably they are. But
yeah, but you know, that's the tension. I think the major thing we have to get back to is funding local news outlets. Like in the US, those have just been destroyed. And so, you know, every study has shown that people trust local journalism more than they trust these sort of national, international outlets, because there's no real touch points that they have with those outlets. And so that whether real or perceived, there's this sort of corporate agendas, political agendas behind them that is quite different from your local news outlet, where it's the guy that you see at your kid's soccer game. And, you know, there's just more trust in the information coming there. And those have just been obliterated or taken over by these sort of monolithic corporations. So they're local, but they're not really local because they're owned by the same place and they're given pieces of content to run. So I think that, and I mean, there have been a few models that have outlined how we can do this, but that's one of the things that I think we need to get back towards, where we do have credible journalists. So these are professionals, this is their career, and they suffer when they put things out that turn out not to be accurate. But we don't go to a place where we say, well, there's only 10 outlets we're going to deem to be credible. So I think the solution there is really funding professional news outlets at the local level. So that would be the tension, the way I deal with that tension of just not saying that, like, okay, every news outlet that pops up online is treated equally based on clicks and engagement. We've seen where that goes, and it's not good because it fuels the sort of rage journalism that we've seen in the junk news. But I don't think we also want to go to the thing of like, all right, here are the 10 national news outlets that have gotten the check mark, and that's what you're going to see. So we got to find the middle ground there. And I think the solution is finding a way to fund local, but professional, independent news outlets.
Do you have any ideas about how we could do that?
Well, I mean, there have been a few solutions. There have been things like digital taxes on some of these companies that would go into a pot to fund local news outlets, because what we see is the free market approach is just not working. It's not, and I don't think it's going to start working, because it's not just a thing of saying that, like, okay, we'll throw you a bone here, you know, local Iowa newspaper, and in your community, you'll show up a little bit higher in people's news feeds on Facebook. Like, that is not going to solve their financial problems, because what you've torn out of newspapers are all the things that used to fund newspapers, and that being that, like, the movie listings, the classifieds, all of the things that used to be 80% of newspapers are gone. Like, the news was the sort of add-on to a lot of the things that people would see, and those aren't coming back. I mean, you know, it's going to be Auto Trader, it's going to be eBay. So I don't think a free market approach to local journalism is going to work. So there has to be some sort of funding mechanism that allows those outlets to exist. Like in the US, this is probably a much harder thing to sell maybe than in Europe, because we tend to be very opposed to, you know, government funded news, even if it's behind a pretty clear firewall that would cut them off from having influence. So I don't know what the actual solution is, but there are a lot of proposals out there, many of which I think make some sense. And you know, we just have to kind of sift through them and figure out if there's anything that is practical.
So like we've been talking about these issues in the sort of like having this public conversation for quite a while. Like the stuff that I've written about in my book came up 3-4 years ago when I was first starting to look at these issues, and today we've essentially done nothing about it. Like the EU passed the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, but aside from that, we've done very little, and I've been trying to work out why that is, given that it's such a monstrous part of 21st century life. Like, what are your thoughts?
I think there's two reasons we've been slow to address the problem. One is most lawmakers don't understand tech at all. That probably improved a bit over the last 4 years, but when we were having these conversations back in 2016, 2017, you were at the point of legitimately trying to explain what an algorithm is and what a bot is versus a troll. I mean, you're starting from a very basic level there. And for obvious reasons, lawmakers were uncomfortable regulating spaces they didn't fully understand themselves. So I think that led to a bit of paralysis. I think the second part is up until about 2014, let's say, there was this sort of utopian view of tech and social media. And people looked at the Arab Spring as being where social media was going, where you'd have these sort of democratic activist movements that would be allowed to blossom online. And so there was an effort to really allow social media to kind of expand and run on its own because of the great democratic process or promise of social media. And then I think the third is probably a lot of them were weaponizing social media themselves. So they didn't want to regulate a space that they were using at some level, whether consciously or unconsciously, to manipulate voters. So you had, I think, these three roadblocks that meant that the issue just wasn't addressed seriously until a few years ago. The last couple of years, I know the US context way more. I mean, you've seen a number of proposals that have come up that because of political partisanship have gone nowhere. Frankly, some good, some bad. But I think there is now an appetite to do something. Now, that's, of course, a little bit dangerous because when you just say do something, that could lead to bad regulation. But my expectation would be in the next 2 to 4 years, I think we will actually see a bit more robust regulation in this space, because I think many of those hurdles have been sort of crossed at this point. We sort of crossed the Rubicon into like something has to be done at this point. And like, again, both sides in the US agree on that. They just fundamentally disagree on what to do about it. But yeah, I mean, I think going back to your question of why haven't we seen any of this happen yet, it's a combination of those three things, probably many other reasons, including lobbyists and everything else. But I think you look at the early hearings on Capitol Hill, and the tech executives just ran circles around lawmakers and made them look, frankly, pretty ignorant. And
I mean,
so
I think they probably are, like, or were at least. I don't think they made them look like that. They actually are.
Correct. I mean, you saw a lot of questions that were just absurd. And I think this was the problem, is you got these people and their lobbyists in rooms, and you'd have even a lawmaker who's trying to like earnestly address some of these problems, and they just had sort of circles run around them and just could throw out tech terms and these various things that like most people don't fully grasp. And I think that led to the sort of position of like, I don't know what I'm doing here, hence I am not going to be as engaged as I perhaps should be. But again, I think there is enough momentum now to get something done, and there are a few lawmakers who do understand these issues. Mark Warner, for example, who represents Virginia, like he actually has a pretty fundamentally sound understanding of the tech space. So we may see some things happen in the next couple of years, which we didn't see in the last 4. But I don't know, maybe I'm being too optimistic and giving them too much credit.
Yeah, I mean, I still think it's fairly ironic that for the last 4 years, the person probably with the most understanding about how to utilize social media was the president, who was just using it to like troll, like, right. But for whatever reason, I've heard many theories on why he was so good at it, but he seemed to have this like instinctual understanding of how to get the best, or maybe not the best, the biggest reaction from whatever he decided to tweet about. Like he, even though I think it was way more calculated than people think. But it's going to be interesting to watch how the Democrats kind of deal with it, because I've seen some red states like Florida and Texas both talk about like trying to demand freedom of speech be enforced in their state for social media, and like I have no idea how that's going to go. Because I didn't even think a country could do it until Australia have done it, and now a whole bunch. Now there's like some battle going on with Australia and Facebook and news outlets. So
yeah, you've also seen some states. California, for example, has implemented their own version of GDPR, for example. So,
oh really?
Yeah, I think there's actually going to be more of an appetite by the big tech companies to be regulated, because what they don't want are 600 different regulations that are just, I mean, impossible to enforce and to continue to be a sort of functional operation. So I think they will push for regulation that remains beneficial to them. And by that, I mean, like, yes, it dings some of their business interests, maybe, but it also kind of creates a moat around them, because to be able to stay on the right side of new legislation, it's obviously very expensive. I mean, you need a ton of content moderators, you need a ton of lawyers. All of these things will make it harder for these small and mid-sized social media platforms to compete if like 80% of your workforce has to focus on making sure that you are adhering to whatever legislation has now been implemented in Kazakhstan and Kansas. Like, that is actually probably a decent thing for the big companies, because it makes it hard for the competitors to stay viable. But yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, we've seen big tech actually come out and endorse some regulation against big tech. If you're cynical about that, you kind of look at it and say, well, this can be perceived as helping them because it makes it very hard for their competitors to enforce these rules.
Yeah, I mean, was like Facebook are having that big fight with Australia at the minute, but I've seen some people suggesting that all it is doing is using, like, they're attempting to like get big tech to back up the institutional kind of legacy media at the expense of alternative media, who would potentially be actually more critical of them, and that like by partnering or by pushing enough revenue towards like legacy media, you can effectively kill independent media, or at least their influence. So there's a lot of battles to be had, but Bret, I want to thank you for your time. It's been a super interesting conversation.
Yeah, it's great to join you again.
Not a problem. Do you want to plug anything before we go?
I'll plug your book for you. I'll take my time to plug your book again.
Oh, awesome. Well, I'll send you a PDF if you want to have a look at it.
Please do.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much. Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.